Hi, I'm Robert Walters. I work for BA Training Solutions. This session is to give you a taster for what it's like to attend one of our virtual training courses and to give you an opportunity to see a small subset of our materials. All of our events are highly interactive, where we deliver the course content through a mixture of tutor-led presentation, group discussion, but also many individual and team-based exercises. So of course for this session there's no audience participation that you'd normally have on one of our courses. Also, all of our delegates do receive a hard copy of our slides, plus a separate workbook that contains the exercises and sample answers, and also sample exam papers. So this course is the Foundation Certificate in Business Analysis that's based on the third edition. And for this taster session, I'm going to give you a fairly brief overview of the business analysis process model, which is taken from page 58 of the business analysis book. So this is the model, which contains 5 phases. As you can see, business context feeds into all of the work that we undertake. And really what this model is giving us is a framework for how we undertake some business analysis work. So in terms of business context, that's really covering information about the organisation itself, as well as the outside world. So in terms of the organisation, a business analyst needs to be familiar with where the organisation is heading going forward, and that should be set out in some sort of vision or mission statement. Very importantly though, what the organisation strategy actually says, what the overall business objectives are, and also its short-term tactics. We also need to think about the outside world. So we cover a range of techniques that enable us to examine the external environment. For example, PESTLE is a technique that we elaborate on during the full course, which is examining factors under the headings of political, economic, social, cultural, technological, legal, and environmental. So that sort of business context information around the organisation and the wider environment needs to feed into the work that we perform. So let's go into our first phase of the model, where we investigate situation. So in this phase, the business analyst is going out there and building a business overview for what we look like currently as an organisation. So for that to happen, we need to have that broader business context understanding and the business strategy feeding into this piece of work. We also need to ensure that the problem area is defined, and that might be set out for us as part of some sort of project initiation document or project definition report or terms of reference. But essentially what we need to know is why we're doing it. So in other words, what are the objectives? Also, what's the scope? So are we looking across a whole organisation or a targeted area of the business? What constraints do we need to work within? So that could be around timescales and costs. Who is the authority or the person sponsoring this piece of work? And what resources are available for us to work with? It's good to eradicate any assumptions. Sometimes people assume they know what the problem is, when in fact what we're experiencing is more the effect and not the root cause. And we do need to identify relevant stakeholders who can help us gain that sort of understanding of the organisation. Importantly, those stakeholders will also need to be engaged as we go into the further phases of the process model. So there's a range of investigation techniques that we expand on fully in the course, and that includes interviews, workshops, observations, shadowing, surveys, for example, focus groups, and many others. So having gone out there and done the investigation work, we then would want to summarise what we've discovered. So we might use a mind map to do that, or we might create a rich picture as a way of summarising the entire situation. So having now got that broad understanding, we can now move into the next phase. So consider perspectives is where we're doing some analysis of the relevant stakeholders that we'd previously identified. And what we're trying to understand is where those stakeholders believe the organisation should be heading in the future. And it might be that different stakeholders do have a different view and may be unaware that they hold those different views. So there is a structured technique called CATWO that helps us to understand a particular perspective around the direction of the organisation. It stands for customer, actor, transformation, worldview, owner and environment. And again, it's a technique that we expand on in depth in the full course. Those perspectives will then influence the activities that are performed by the business system or systems. And for us as a business analyst, how can we improve our business systems if we haven't even agreed what activities we're going to be performing as an organisation? So if you take the example of Ryanair versus British Airways, if we were an airline company, what sort of airline company do we want to be? So if it's more Ryanair, our focus is going to be very much around low cost. Whereas if it's British Airways, our focus is going to be much more around those activities that provide that extra service that customers are expecting and willing to pay for. So what we do for each stakeholder is pull together a CATWO, and then for each perspective, we pull together a business activity model. And the BAM documents all the activities that reflect that particular perspective. So what we may end up with is a number of different BAMs, and those BAMs, may differ to each other. So what we then need to do is work with our stakeholders to get to a consensus BAM. And all this is sort of conceptual or future-based. So a CATWO and BAM is always around where we're trying to get to in the future based on that stakeholder's perspective. So coming out of this phase will be this consensus and conceptual business activity model. So we can now move into analyse needs. Essentially what we're doing here is gap analysis. So the input to this step is the agreed business activity model. And what we're doing really is looking at the difference between where we want to get to in the future and where we are now to determine what changes are required. In reality, that's going to require a lot of further detailed investigation with our stakeholders. So things like process modelling techniques can assist with that. But what we're looking at is that consensus BAM and examine the activities on it to understand whether they exist or not. So if they don't exist currently, then we have some significant gaps. Maybe they do exist currently, but are performing quite poorly, in which case we have some gaps. And ultimately, those gaps will be filled with improvements or initiatives or projects. So now we've identified the gaps and the potential changes, we then need to think about the options that are available to fill those gaps. So what we want to do is think about feasibility. And the three areas of feasibility we might want to explore. So that includes business feasibility, technical feasibility, and financial feasibility. And what we're doing really is deciding which option or options are the ones most viable for the organisation. So what we do is create a business case. And that business case can then enable those decision makers within the business to decide on what the next steps are. The business case contains benefits and costs and investment appraisal. But what we also need to document are risks. So if we were to adopt this change or changes, do we expose the organisation to an unnecessary set of risks, but also impacts in terms of wider implications for the organisation if we were to go ahead with this change. So now we've convinced our decision makers of the change to go forward with, we can now move on to the final phase of the process model. So this is where we define requirements. And those requirements are essentially changes required to business systems. So that may include IT systems, in which case we need to elicit functional and non-functional requirements. But it may also be changes to the organisation structure. So that could be around merging of teams, for example. It could be around job roles and responsibilities. and it could be around changes to our processes. So process and data modelling techniques might help us with this. Those requirements, once they've been elicited, then need to be documented, they need to be validated with the stakeholders, and then also managed as we go through the project lifecycle. So that brings us to the end of the model, although it's not quite the end of the story, because having defined requirements, we then need to move on and support the solution design, but also the development of the solution, the testing of it, and the implementation of it. But this slide summarises the process model. It also shows you the key inputs and the key outputs. And for the foundation certificate exam, there are quite often questions around the sequence of the process model, but also the inputs and outputs. I hope you've enjoyed this brief overview of the process model. It was just to give you a flavour of our training courses. If you would like to know more, please contact us using the email or telephone number that you can see. And you can also see full details of our training courses at our website, businessanalystsolutions.com. Thank you, and hopefully hear from you soon.